You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network.
Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on. Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on. Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on.
Happy Monday. This is Mondays at the Overhead Wire, sponsored by our generous Patreon supporters. I'm Jeff Wood, your host, and joined by Han Solo. That's right. Every Wookiee's favorite right-hand man is here to help me with this episode. If you're not familiar, if you haven't been listening since the start, I usually would get a Han Solo shot glass to drink some Citron or something along those lines to help me get through the podcast. So that's kind of where that comes from. And, if you're new to the podcast, that's that's where we're always Han Solo and we're ever talking about Wookiees. So I appreciate everybody listening in. And, as we do when we're Han Solo, I've got some programming notes for Talking Headways to start off the podcast, coming soon as it were, So we've got some great shows coming up, including a roundtable discussion on the public wealth of cities, which we recorded last week. I was really happy with how that one turned out after it was finished. I was really nervous going into it because we had 4 guests, which I don't think I've ever had 4 guests before. And if I have, I don't remember doing it. Maybe I blacked out because it's a lot of people to kind of get to answer questions and coordinate. So it was fun to do that. And and so also we've got a recording come up with Max Holleran on his book, Yes to the City. That's going to be really fun. Helen Chin and Stephanie Gideby are going to be back to talk about the 1-year anniversary of the infrastructure bill. We're excited about that one. I just got a book in the mail called Speculative Futures on the Future of Cities. So I'm looking forward to reading that one and sharing the results with you as well. So lots of fun stuff going on. Oh, and we've also got some Revolution recordings planned as well. I'm going to try to get some folks to come into my office at the conference and record a couple podcasts. So we're going to do that as well. Not as many as I did, I think, in Denver a number of years ago. I think I did 6 or 7 podcast recordings, and I was like shot for like the next month. But then it's good that I got 7 recordings because then I could kind of relax for a month and a half. But I really needed that after trying to fit in so many and doing so much research for 7 podcasts ahead of a 2-day period. That was not a good idea. So this time we'll probably have 2 or 3 is my best guess, and then some plenaries and things like that when it comes from the Revolution podcast, which I hope folks get a chance to listen to. Obviously, we repost some of those episodes here, but you can go and get those at the Revolution podcast as well because they're very supportive of Talking Headways and our work here. Also, thanks to everybody who listens to the show, and I'm really glad folks are enjoying the show. I've been getting some really good Patreon feedback and support from there. We also had Megan Kimball on to talk about the Texas highways last week, and that was one great discussion, especially how Megan really connected all the sprawl in North and South Austin to this horrible highway decision about expanding I-35. So really exciting stuff there. Really good insight, and I look forward to having her back when her book comes out. Actually, she's going to do. I can tell already it's going to be really amazing, and I'd love to talk to her about it when it comes out. And all the research that she's doing is done. And, we've got lots of other things planned. I'm still working on that Kingwood Trails episode. I have to kind of get back on my horse and do that one, but we got a lot of other things planned as well. So again, putting together the podcast week after week, it's super fun to talk to all these people about all these cool things that they're doing, and also transportation, urban planning, urban design, all those things. And so hopefully you guys continue to enjoy it. I enjoy making them. I hope you continue to enjoy listening to them. Okay, so now let's talk about our T-shirt, or mug, or sticker, or poster, or whatever. Those folks who have been asking for some shirts, I think that I'm gonna try to get the Overhead Wire logo, which is that streetcar logo, as a shirt too. But this one, I collaborated with artist and listener Richard Wazensky, who's doing some amazing Inktober sketches on his Instagram. Dick David Sketches is his name on there. You can search him, and he does lots of robots and really cool stuff like that. But check him out because the Inktober is here. I guess it's like Movember in a way that people, there's a prompt every day, and so the artists on Instagram draw something related to the prompt, and his drawings are always really great. But he also designed a shirt for us entitled "Cars Are Cholesterol," and we really had fun making it. We designed a heart as the city and arteries with highways that are clogged with cars in them, and I thought it was a really fun idea. And I think it's really, really cool, and I hope folks like it. We're selling them at TeePublic, and I put the link in the show notes, and you can always use bit.ly/cars or cholesterol as well. I made a special link for that one. And if you order one, let me know what color. And I think I mentioned before that I'm really fond of the purple. So check it out if you get a chance. Also, because we cover so many books, I mentioned last time I've partnered with bookshop.org as an affiliate. This means that if you buy a book through the Overhead Wire shop on Bookshop, a small amount of that purchase goes to us. Order of operations, make sure you go to your local bookstore, make sure you order from your local bookshop, make sure you get it from the publisher. And then if all those options run out, feel free to come to our bookshop shop and get all the books that you can, because we've got a huge list of them. All the authors that we've ever had on the show are in the bookshop. So check that out. It's like our little book club that we've got going on there. And folks have been ordering Better Buses, Better Cities by Stephen Higashide, Constructing Community by Jeremy Levine, Bike Lanes or White Lanes by Melody Hoffman. A lot of really cool books on there. All the books we've ever discussed on the show, as I said, will be on that in the shop. Bookshop.org/shop/The Overhead Wire. Bookshop.org/shop/The Overhead Wire. Got to get those fixed in my tongue. So, well, okay, this is episode 119. We're in session. And as you know, you can get this podcast on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, and of course, Apple Podcasts. Thanks to everybody who subscribes through their podcatchers. We really, really appreciate it. So let's get to the news, shall we? This is what you're here for. Here are a few stories that piqued our interest from the newsletter of the last few weeks. Go to theoverheadwire.com and sign up for the 2-week free trial. No credit card needed, just your email address. And then after, if you're finished and you want to sign out and get rid of us, we don't keep any emails. We're not like those crazy political campaigns who will email you later. Once it gets deleted from MailChimp, it's gone. And I'm more than happy to get rid of it. I clean the list fairly frequently to make sure the numbers stay down, because it is actually expensive. MailChimp's expensive to get those mails out, but I'm super glad that we have it. We go through about 1,500 news items, and we really appreciate going through them and finding the really good ones, and having our readers find the really good ones for us as well by clicking through. And those are the ones that we like to talk about at the front of the news section. So let's start, shall we? Okay, how transportation choice affects happiness. Yingling Fan at the University of Minnesota wanted to know whether happiness can be one of the emotions you feel on your trip to work. Using a smartphone app to survey 400 people, they found that biking and walking best promote happiness, followed by short trips on public transit. Fan's research found longer car trips are stressful and associated with more feelings of sadness. That was by Andrew Hazard at NPR News, Minnesota Public Radio. So the University of Minnesota and Yingling Fan, who has done really great work with the Accessibility Observatory, with the University of Minnesota, with all the really cool stuff that they're doing up there. They designed a smartphone app called Dynamica and tracked people for a week. And they got about 400 people to sign on. And so they looked at driving, bus, rail, walking, biking, and riding in vehicles such as carpooling, taxi service, and ride shares. And, basically our findings show that biking and walking are the happiest ways to get around. And that's really super exciting. Taking transit and like a bus or a train is a more enjoyable than a longer driving commute. But driving alone for short distances, she says, at under a half an hour is a fairly happy experience too, which I was a little bit surprised about, but I guess not, because if it's really short trip, you're not really thinking about it. Maybe you get to catch up on your favorite podcast, maybe you get to, same with your bus or train trip, but a short driving trip is actually pretty pleasurable apparently to people. But long drives, long commutes are actually more sad and stressful for the longer, higher traffic trips. And of course, driving with passengers is more enjoyable no matter the distance, they found in the research. So that's really, really an interesting finding. Obviously, if you're going to have a buddy to commute with you either way, on bikes or on transit, or if you have somebody to chat with, or if you're commuting with your friend, the podcast, which I used to do a lot when I was commuting to Oakland every day. Every day I made sure that I was loaded up on my iPod and going into work to listen to my shows, my sports shows, my history shows, and those types of things. So really interesting stuff there. I will note, though, that taking a bus overall is the least happy transportation mode in the Twin City. The long bus ride is what makes people the least happiest, although transit makes people pretty happy. Just lots of really interesting stuff here. They also created a transportation happiness map, which is really cool too. So go check that out if you get a chance. Obviously, all these articles and the links to them are in the show notes, direct links to the stories. So check it out if you get a chance. This was as I said, from NPR News. So okay, let's go to the next one. A Tale of Two Skylines in North Carolina. After 4 decades, the results of 2 paths for 2 North Carolina downtowns have become clear. Charlotte and its tall skyline were influenced by an architect, mayor, and a bank owner. Raleigh, the state capital, stayed low and grew more organically and targeted 8 centers around the downtown, spearheaded by former planning director Mitchell Silver. Whether Raleigh will follow Charlotte's skyline height remains to be seen. So this was by J. Michael Welton in The Assembly, which is a North Carolina magazine. As someone who is only familiar in passing with Raleigh and Charlotte, I found this to be interesting history of the downtowns for somebody who might not know much about the urban design decisions or the history. And I've been to Charlotte. I really enjoy the city. I imagine it's going to be awesome with all the trees changing color really soon because of the fall. I've been there at Thanksgiving a number of times for cross-country meets back in high school, and it was really great. I loved all the seasons and things because we didn't really get that much in Texas. It's either green or the leaves are off the trees. And here in the Bay Area, obviously, it's permafall. But going to Charlotte, it's really pretty. And this time of year, October, November, those are the best. But for the cities, it really goes to show, how having a city champion can change the urban design of your city even. So Charlotte, while dominated by a banker's ideas and an urban design mayor, as told in the article specifically, it really does get to a more dense skyscraper type urbanism. And some people like that, others not so much. But it really changes the way that those two cities have developed over time and made them stark choices from each other. So, I guess, if you have a choice about what city you want to live in, that choice is actually very distinct in North Carolina. If you get to choose between Charlotte and Raleigh, you have kind of a lower rise urbanism, or Charlotte, this is a higher rise urbanism. You got the light rail and all that stuff in Charlotte. So interesting to see the differences in the histories of these two cities and whether actually Raleigh is going to follow Charlotte's lead in terms of the urbanism, or whether it's just going to stay the same in terms of the low rise and doing that from those centers, those 8 centers that were in the plan. So interesting stuff there. If folks are from Raleigh or North Carolina, obviously this is kind of a 30,000 foot look at the difference between the downtowns, but I'd love to hear more from folks if you live there or if you're a connoisseur of downtowns in North Carolina. It would be great to hear your thoughts on that. TheOverheadWire@gmail.com if anybody wants to write in. Appreciate that. Okay. 75 years of development made the effects of Hurricane Ian worse. Hurricane Ian shaped up to be a devastating storm, wiping out houses and infrastructure all along Florida's west coast. Making that problem worse was the specific way that Southwest Florida was developed through wetland reclamation and engineering. Over decades, the area was transformed by people and machines, making the region more likely to flood with stronger storms. This was by Zeke Baker in the Washington Post. I think we've done a really, really poor job of understanding how to design with nature rather than dominate it. And I think this is a perfect example, as is Louisiana, of how our need to control nature comes back to kind of bite us in the butt later on. In Louisiana specifically, I'm more familiar with Louisiana because I lived in Texas for a while, and we'd go over to New Orleans or go over that way if we were going to Charlotte, like I said. In Louisiana, a lot of the storm surge protection is gone as the Mississippi hasn't been able to go where it wants to go to bring all the sediment. And in Florida, a lot of the salt marshes and the regular marshes are paved over or reconstructed to be like a Venice with canals and low-rise housing. But when you have 7 to 10 foot storm surges, it really doesn't help, and it's not helpful to have gotten rid of all of those kind of those barriers, the mangroves and all the wetlands and stuff where the water washes into. And so if you build that property up to the coast, it's going to get flooded. And so I was actually corresponding with a colleague this last week who was in the storm and noted that their house just barely avoided flooding, even though it was built at a 10-foot increase over the land. And they said their doorstep had water on it, but no flooding inside. And so they'd built up actually 10 feet above the sea level, and they got lucky. Smart to build up and lucky that it wasn't worse. But that's pretty amazing that basically the water was lapping at your front door, even though if you were 10 feet above ground. And I think that's I think a lot of people have said that the strength of this storm really caught them by surprise. I think the location of it, the way it came into Florida, was kind of a surprise. Beforehand, people thought it was going to go further north, and it didn't. So I think a lot of what climate change is doing is changing the veracity of these storms, changing their directions. They're a little bit more unpredictable than they were before, people have been saying, and they're more powerful than they had been before. So Lots to think of, especially when you're redeveloping. But back to Mississippi, the Mississippi River has really been wanting to change course away from New Orleans for a really long time. The Atchafalaya River Basin, which goes off south, when you go north from Baton Rouge, you can, the north of the river, it actually wants to go right instead of where it goes left now into New Orleans. And so the river over time has changed course many times. And so we keep on pushing it to go one direction when it really wants to go everywhere and bring that sediment out to protect all those, it's obviously not meaning to protect the landforms and stuff, but it actually changes its area over time. And I think the Army Corps of Engineers really kind of putting all those levees and making sure it's channeled has really affected how the ecology of the place has changed. And so I think that really makes a difference. And so we've engineered stuff to be a little bit more stressful on us as humans, even if we are trying to make it do what we want it to do. So anyways, I'm always fascinated by that. I'm always fascinated by the Atchafalaya River Basin and where the Mississippi River would have gone if we would have kind of let it and let it kind of change course. I'm sure this happens all the time in rivers because they're organic. They go where they want to go. And over time, if humans try to channel them, then things change that aren't supposed to change and all those things. So lots of interesting stuff, lots of interesting thoughts on that one. And, the development in Florida has really not helped from the damage that's happened. So I hope that we can figure it out. There's been a lot of articles specifically saying that maybe they shouldn't rebuild in some of these places, but I imagine that they will. It's just kind of what happens. Okay, next up. The importance of pink in Latin American architecture. Pink is an important color in Latin America, and especially in Mexico, with Rosa Mexicano seen in crafts, textiles, and even taxis. Because most buildings are built with stucco, they were given color to make them more lively and elicit emotion. Local materials play a huge part in how places create their own identity, and as things become more mass-produced, a place's character can fade. This was by Sandy Sanchez in Architectural Digest. I love this story. I like these stories about architecture, about history, about places, specifically this one, how color is used in other countries. They really do hit on why American architecture and mass housing have become kind of stale in color and boring. First, people are averse to color, and they like their grays and their browns, and they don't like to stand out too much. But also, it's really the local building materials that make things, quote, unquote, local. One of the things in Raymond Unwin's Town Planning and Practice, you can go to raymondunwin.com and get the book, listen to it on audio. But one of the things in Town Planning and Practice that I think is really important is that each town has a character related to local building materials. And even in England, after the Industrial Revolution and the invention of steam engines, did the vernaculars of a lot of places change. The urban design of a lot of places changed. No longer were designs regional, but they became more homogenous as the trains brought materials from certain parts of the country, and so then they can be replicated. So I'd love to see us go back to some localism. I wonder what that might look like in a lot of places, and kind of the design, how that would change based on where you were. Here in San Francisco, obviously we have our Victorians, but that's not like a local design. That's more of an England design because of the time period. But it would be really interesting to see, like, if we designed with the fog in mind, what would that mean for our places? Like, would we be able to wring water out of the atmosphere and use it for, gardens or, herbs and things like that? Would we be able to harness the cool air that comes in the whole times, most of the year? And what would that mean? And what would we do for sunlight and those types of things? So I just think that's really fascinating. So I wonder what it might look like in a lot of different places, not just San Francisco. But I really like this idea of local vernacular, local design that takes into account the environment. And it kind of goes back to that Florida discussion. Basically a lot of the houses in the South and everywhere else around the world really were built with the environment in mind. And in India, they have a lot of brick or even stone buildings to keep the place cool in really hot summers. In there have breezeways, you have dog runs, you have all kinds of ways to design buildings where you can keep cool or stay warm depending on what's going on. I know in Yemen, the I can't remember the name of the city, but it's like that city of mud brick, and basically the mud brick actually keeps the house cool in the daytime and makes sure that it stays warm at night. And I think that that's a perfect kind of example of how using architecture to make us thermally comfortable is a really interesting way to go. So this is really interesting just because of the way that they use color. Pink is such a Latin American thing in architecture, and I love the really colorful cities that you see when you're in a Latin American place. It's really cool. So hopefully we can kind of get back to some of that. But I imagine that we'll continue to be globalist in our thinking about architecture, thinking everybody's kind of getting on the same page and doing these buildings that are similar all over the world. Okay. What's keeping people from returning to the office? This is a super popular topic right now. Before I read the little intro, it's a super popular topic right now, and I get so many articles about this. I think like people on the coasts are like so fascinated with returning to the office because of how the office markets are going. But anyways, I digress. Fewer people are going to the office every day than before the pandemic, and despite the tempting lures of free breakfast and other perks, the main thing keeping people away seems to be the arduous daily commute. This is especially true for transit riders who live in suburbs with poor service and long commutes. Another piece in Slate, when asked what would get people back into the office, the two main requests were childcare provision and getting rid of open offices. For many white-collar workers, work may have changed forever. So this was in Slate, and then Sarah Green Carmichael in Bloomberg/The Washington Post. They seem to share articles a lot. I found this one really interesting because for a long time, the thing big tech companies here in the Bay Area at least did in particular was try to keep people in the office with table tennis or free meals or whatever it was. Some of them even have healthcare and childcare. But now it falls on these commercial landlords to think about ways to bring people back to the office. And I imagine daycare is really important for a lot of people. And in the Slate article specifically, people said that keeps them coming into the office 5 days a week is the provision of childcare. And I think that that's a huge benefit. But the commute ultimately for a lot of people is rough. I mean, it might be good on some days to get away, but others, even a good transit trip just takes time out of the day, and his time is something you just can't get back ever. It's just one of those things. So I think, it's frustrating for people to see these conversations always about the commercial office people wanting and markets and everybody wanting people to come back to the downtowns, wanting people to come back to the office. And there is something to be said about the downtown and the thriving nature of it during, when there's a lot of employment, especially if a city or town has built up their whole downtown around that kind of ecosystem. But what happens is that you become like monocentric in what you're providing with your downtown. And this is something that I think a lot of downtowns have done, is because you can build a lot of office, and because office is really expensive and you can build taller in downtowns, it actually makes it so that you become very focused on a single kind of industry, not necessarily like tech or anything like that, but like just office space, rather than having your offices spread out, having your residential kind of take over a lot of the downtown to make sure that everywhere has a similar level of office and residential, so that you have like that more of that work balance, work residential balance. I think would be really making things much different in a lot of downtowns. I wonder actually if places like obviously Paris has its urban core and its its office spaces too, and like the La Defense and things like that. But I wonder how much European cities are impacted by this type of kind of office focus that the United States cities are, like New York and San Francisco. It'd be really interesting to hear more about that. I haven't seen much, but I'm sure there's something different between those and here. But so I think childcare is going to be a big part of it. I think getting a vaccine that actually will mucosally make sure that you can't get the virus, rather than just the shot that goes through muscle fibers. If you have one that's a nasal inhaling shot, I think, or a vaccine, I think that's going to make a huge difference. And I think they're coming up with those, but it's going to make it so that it'll be harder to get the virus because it won't be able to come through your mouth and your nose. And so I think there's going to be a big difference, and it's going to probably come in the next couple of years. I know that there's a lot of work being done on it, but it's something that I don't know if it's actually going to be all of the provisions that these buildings are going to thing, or it's actually going to be that defense through better vaccines and that type of stuff. Okay. Omaha ripping up its only protected bikeway. Omaha, Nebraska will not continue a protected bike lane pilot project that had seen positive results after an advisory committee tied to the mayor recommended taking it out after the city council had reaffirmed its support for the bike lane. The local bike advocacy group, Bike Walk Nebraska, was not invited to the committee meeting and has since cut ties with that advisory committee. R.J. Rowell and Chris Bowling at the Omaha Reader, reported this. And, I've tried to read and understand what was going on with the political machinations in the city, but I just can't understand it. So, what I kind of just summarized was my complete understanding with it. Maybe we can get some folks from Bike Walk Nebraska to maybe explain in more detail. But basically, the mayor had like this advisory group, and Bike Walk Nebraska was a part of it. And I guess they had private funding to do a bike lane pilot, and then they did it, and then it was successful. But then the mayor, and I'm sure like some NIMBYs didn't like it, so they got it ripped out. And it's really frustrating. Something similar kind of happened in Alameda, although they did say that they were going to put it back into the bike network, protected lanes back. But, these types of changes come pretty frequently where a mayor or somebody will just be like, okay, well, we're done with this. We're not going to do it anymore because of the political pressure they get from I feel like it's a few people. It's not like this, like everybody in the city is up in arms over a bike lane. It's just a bunch of really loud people who believe in autocentricity, and it's frustrating. And I really do believe we need a lot more protected infrastructure. And it's unfortunate that city leaders really don't get it. They just don't understand. A lot of them don't get it. And it's really unfortunate, and decisions like this happen. And so the only protected bike lane in Omaha gets ripped out, and we don't know if any of them are ever going to come back. So we'll see what happens, but it's frustrating for sure. Okay. And finally, in our first section, are economies less dynamic as they age? Yale University Press is re-releasing a 1982 book by Mancur Olson entitled The Rise and Decline of Nations, which discusses how when economies get older, they get less dynamic and more bogged down by process and the accumulation of interest groups. While initially the thesis didn't make sense, scholars like Ed Glazer see now how it applies to cities that impact the economy of the U.S. by refusing to build housing and entrenching power in existing interest groups. This was by Walter Frick at the Harvard Business Review. Originally, in the article, it says Ed Glazer originally thought it didn't make a lot of sense because of the eras of Reagan and Clinton, where the economy kept on increasing over time, and I think that was a technology increase rather than kind of a productivity increase through policies and things like that. And I feel like I'd really love to have somebody discuss this one with, because, and maybe we'll circle back in the future, because I find this really fascinating and true. It seems really like our processes got bogged down when rules and regulations started stacking up and kind of conflicting with each other. And then a lot of interest groups got involved to protect certain rules. And so things have been hard to do. And I think this is something that has frustrated people for a long time, and it gets tapped into by certain political elements. It takes forever to do things, and that's part of a structure that's been built up over a really long time, and it favors certain inertias like car autocentricity and those types of things. Now those inertias are hard to push back on and really entrenched. And this is why California's movement on housing actually has been really impressive lately. The groups that are pushing for changes in housing law and pushing back on the housing department at the state to audit places like San Francisco, which are really frustratingly not building housing as fast as they should. But we need that all over the place, not just California, and not just housing. We need it for transportation. We need it for everything. And I think that there's just a lot of arguments about what's going wrong and why it's taking so long to build transit projects, why it's taking so long to build transmission lines, why it's taking so long to get permitting done. Do it this way, don't do it that way. We don't want it to do the Republican way, we want to do it the Democratic way. Well, the Democratic way is a certain way, and that one's frustrating too. So I think we need a different paradigm on transportation and safety, as well as other things like healthcare and food security and all this stuff. And, there's lots to think about this piece and expand on, because I think it's really important. And obviously the way he wrote it isn't going to be an exact, definition of what we need to change. And I haven't read the book yet, obviously, but I read the article and I thought it was really interesting. But it might, be something that we talk about in the future, because I found it just really interesting in how this kind of inertia works and how these structures work to actually make economies less dynamic over time, and the way that they kind of marketed it out. So if you want to read this piece, it's really interesting. Obviously, like I always say, it's going to be in the show notes. So check it out if you get a chance. And if you have any notes on it or any thoughts about it, let me know. I think it's kind of tied into a lot of the stuff that, people have been working on with the transit cost projects. And I think it ties really well into, I think what, folks like Ezra Klein have been talking about, getting things done in the United States and those types of reforms. So it kind of fits into that overall topic of conversation that's been going on for a while. Okay, so here's a few bonus items. Not the most read, but the most interesting to me. I think. The funny thing about the newsletter is that I really don't know what will and won't take off in terms of what readers are interested in. So some of the things I post, I don't think will do well, and then they become super popular. Other things I think are super interesting, just don't get a lot of traction. So I put together kind of a list of things that didn't quite get traction from the readers, but I think that are really interesting, and they're worth revisiting a little bit, even if they're just like little data bites. I think it's really cool to kind of share some of this stuff. So I'm going to go through these pretty quick. These are some of the things that we do in the newsletter, and so I'm going to share them here. We'll just go through it. In London, when temperatures passed 40 degrees Celsius this summer, foot traffic on the street dropped an astonishing 74%. A similar drop to pandemic restrictions. It was a dramatic lesson in how climate change could impact cities in the future. So an interesting thing there is that they found that, basically when the mercury went up to 40 degrees, footfall dropped, the amount of walking people did to go to shops and things like that. And it was similar to when they had these big restrictions for the pandemic. So I think climate change is ultimately its own pandemic induction machine, as it were. And I think that this is kind of proof of that already. Okay. Next up, heavy trucks make up 6% of vehicles on the roads, but contribute 60% of smog-forming emissions and 55% of particulates. Through electrification of these vehicles, the American Lung Association suggests that 67,000 premature deaths could be stopped by 2050. That was in CNN. Next, Philadelphia will be piloting smart loading zones in Center City with the help of an app that holds a spot for the driver once they are within 15 minutes of the space. The city is looking to ease traffic related to over 600,000 residential deliveries a year. WHYY. One of the things that was interesting from this that actually just popped in my head was that the reason why they do it so that there's 15 minutes, when they're 15 minutes away, they can reserve a space, is that somebody's not sitting at some office somewhere just reserving spaces so that nobody can park there. And so I think that geographic element is really interesting to this loading zone thing. And I think that, more cities are going to experiment with loading zones moving forward. And I think that's a space to watch. New research finds that from a CO2 perspective, banning short-haul flights and replacing them with rail in Europe will lower emissions, but the majority of emissions are from long-haul flights when measured by spent fuel. Flights longer than 4,000 kilometers make up 47% of emissions, while under 500 kilometers make up only 5.9% of emissions. The study didn't address particulate matter or concentrated pollution at airports. This was in the Journal of Transport Geography. I mean, hey, that makes sense. The longer flights are going to take up more, spend more fuel and create more emissions. But I kind of don't like the premise that they're saying. I mean, and I saw a thread by one of the authors, and he's like, we're not saying that you shouldn't, ban short haul flights and do high speed rail instead. But one of the things that they kind of, inferred was that, it's better to go after the long haul flights. But ultimately, the long haul flights are the ones where you need to actually still fly if you want to get somewhere. And there was a piece today actually in the Washington Post about taxing long haul flights or taxing frequent flyers. And I think that's probably a better way to go to discuss this whole thing. I mean, obviously in a place like France, you can actually, ban flights that are under 500 kilometers or under 250 miles or whatever it is, and then have those by high speed rail because you have the infrastructure. Here in the US, we can't do that yet. I'd love to have that happen sometime in the future. And I imagine that we'll have to in order to reduce emissions before we get to a system where we have electric planes and things like that. But, there's a lot of particulate matter and pollution that happens locally at the airports. And I think, when we talk about emissions, we can't just talk about one type of emissions. We have to talk about all the types of emissions in order to get the whole picture of something. And so I think, areas around places like LAX, areas around places like San Francisco International, really have a lot of pollution and particulates because so many planes take off from there. And it doesn't matter how long they fly. You get this, you get 1,000 planes going in and out. You're going to have 1,000 times, the release of particulates. And so we need to think about it in a number of different ways, not just whether you spend fuel for a longer amount of time or not. Okay, in Fort Stockton, Texas, the school district has had to work hard to attract teachers and has turned into purchasing a motel where they rent rooms to teachers for $250 a month and pay a starting salary for certain subjects higher than most districts in Texas. This was in the Texas Tribune. There's also an article about how in Arizona, there's one district that's actually so short on teachers, they're actually hiring Filipino teachers from the Philippines. And I thought that was a really fascinating article as well. Just kind of like the problem is that, we underpay our teachers. They do a lot. I know a teacher. My sister is a teacher, teaches first grade, and it seems really hard, but she does such a good job, and I'm glad she does it. And I think a lot of the parents are glad she does it too. And, teachers, deserve a lot more accolades than they actually get. They do a really important job, and I think that they should be paid more. I think that it should be a profession that more people, go into. And I think we should actually treat, schools with respect, especially public education. I think there's just so much to be said for, educating the future of America. And as we've fallen a little bit far behind in some of our subjects, I think that there's a real problem with that. And hopefully stuff like this, where Fort Stockton is actually trying to get teachers in and try to figure out a way to do it. I think that they're going to pull out on the stops, whether it's building teacher housing like they're doing here or in Austin, or other ways to just get teachers in. But I think ultimately you just need a bigger pool of teachers so that they can go everywhere. And if you pay them more, then you'll get more applicants, I imagine. In this specific story, there was actually a woman who had taught at her own school for a really long time. And one of the things that actually is benefiting her is that she was getting paid a less amount at her local school district where her family lives, but she'll move to Fort Stockton and kind of finish out her teaching tenure, and then her pension or her retirement will actually be based on that salary amount that they're giving there. So I think that there's some things like that where people might go and spend the last 5 years in a place just to have a really nice extra retirement cushion later on, which is interesting as well. That might, talk to something about how pensions are formed or retirement packages for public workers, but it's something that, keeps people in public service. And anyways, all this stuff is really interesting. Okay, got two more. Regional leaders in San Diego stripped out a road charging provision in their $160 billion long-range transportation plan. While some felt they were just following the will of the people, others fretted about how they were going to reduce emissions to required levels or change driver behavior without it. The San Diego Union Tribune. Lots of political pressure to take out driving fees, specifically in New York and in New Jersey. New Jersey's governor is threatening New York, and New York is threatening New Jersey, and it's really dumb. Because it's so auto-centric in their discussions. They're not actually thinking about the people that actually take transit or have to go between places. And I'm sure they can figure out how to reduce congestion in some way that, that benefits everybody. And I think for me, that's a congestion charge. And there's all this political squabbling seems silly. And the same in San Diego too. I think it's silly that they're taking out the idea of a congestion charge. And I think they kind of bailed because the state might do it anyway. And so that political kind of stress goes further up the chain than the local government. And I think so they're just kind of passing the buck. But it might happen, and, we'll see what happens. But it was a really progressive idea for this $160 billion long-range plan. And is part of this whole restructuring of the MPO, a lawsuit that was pushing kind of the regional planning to think differently about the environment. And, it's kind of got scuttled by some of these politics. So it's interesting to see how that works. Okay, last one. After a sustained effort to limit auto use in Paris, car trips have dropped 45% since 1990. Transit use has increased 30% and bike use 10 times. Local leaders note that a move away from cars must be done carefully in order not to take away freedom from those who have little choice, such as shopkeepers or delivery workers. And this was in Reasons to be Cheerful, which has been putting out really good stuff lately, actually. That's a big drop, 45% since 1990. It's a lot of cars that have been redirected and more transit use and bike use. And that's how you got to do it. You got to design your city so that people are going to use those things. You can't just expect them to do it, And by saying so, you have to design for it. I think that's a really important point. And so it's a really good way to end the news. And I appreciate you all listening in this week. Okay, well, this week and every week, I want to thank our generous Patreon supporters. You guys are awesome and keep the show going by listening and supporting each month. This show and Talking Headways really wouldn't be here without it. So thank you very much. And you can support the show by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. We've had people sign up each month during the pandemic. We're super appreciative of that. $2 a month will get you some stickers and a handwritten note. $10 a month will get you your bus-only scarf or your bike-only scarf. And we have the bike-only and bus-only scarves. They're going like hotcakes. So get yours soon. You can go to theoverheadwire.com, and on the top left square, you can click on it and pick one of your scarves. And people have been ordering multiples, which is really cool too. So go to theoverheadwire.com and get those. Winter is coming, and it's going to be cold, so get a scarf. They're really warm this year. They've got, I feel like they've got extra cotton or something in there. So check it out. They're really cool. I'll be wearing them at Revolution, so I'm excited to do that. And my Carbs or Cholesterol shirt too. You'll see me running around with all the merch. Also, I mentioned it earlier in passing, but RaymondUnwin.com, Town Planning in Practice. We did an audiobook, and I think it's really cool. So check it out if you get a chance. Read Raymond Unwin's 1909 classic. And like I said, if it's the first book on American Planning Association's 100 Essential Books of Reading, check it out, and it will be there for you, RaymondUnwin.com. Okay, listener questions and comments. If you have a comment or a question, feel free to tweet at us or comment on any of the social sites where the podcast appears. We're usually on Twitter, on LinkedIn, on Facebook, and a couple of other places. Feel free to email us at theoverheadwire@gmail.com if you have any questions. And I want to say thanks to everybody who writes in. I really appreciate it. I try to read everybody's emails out if I can. And I love hearing from you, even if you chide me. And I've gotten a few of those lately too. And I had a guest push back on some of my discussion about vegetarianism and climate change that I briefly noted in a few episodes ago. I think it was Harlem banning meat ads, and I might have said something about vegetarianism and its connection to climate change. I'll also note that I won't read the note because it was also filled with some false things and stuff that I don't think I said, because there's like book recommendations that were attributed to me that I would never make. So I'm not going to read it aloud, but I will acknowledge that it was sent in, and I really thank you all for sending me stuff and setting me straight if you feel like I need to be set straight. I appreciate that. If anyone wants to share, with us, go to theoverheadwire@gmail.com. I love hearing from you all. It's really good to get emails and people listen to the show and even see some of the tweets and things like that. So thanks everybody for listening. We really appreciate it. Okay, this is it. Puppies and Butterflies. This is the part of the show where we talk about something fun, interesting, or maybe it just didn't fit in other sections. So there's been lots of things to come out lately, including a guy who built a skateboard that looks like a freight train, which is really interesting and really cool. What's not quite cool is that it can go 22 miles an hour. I kind of fear for his safety. If you look at this thing, it's really tall. It looks like you can eat it pretty good if you're going. But he said it was going downhill, so maybe that's only when it's going downhill. But it looks like a fun idea. There's all kinds of Instagram around of this guy riding a train as a skateboard, which it's like a freight train. It's really funny, a freight engine, and I like it. And also, there's been a lot of discussion, and I haven't read much about it, but I guess Bussi, the mascot, the transit mascot, which is really interesting as well. Maybe I'll save that one for next time. The skateboard train is really, really a fun idea. So that was something fun for this week. And finally, on a kind of a bummer note, I know that a lot of you listen to the show and have heard me talk about my wonderful grandmother, and I lived with her when I first moved to California and visited her every Wednesday up until the pandemic and a bit after as well until Cora was born. Unfortunately, she recently passed away at the age of 109. And, she lived a long and fulfilling life and had seen a lot of technological change and done a lot of really cool things that people didn't really do in her time. She went to Berkeley for college in the 1930s, which was really rare for women at the time. She went to China in the late 80s, which, a lot of people didn't do at that time either. She'd like to travel. She's been all over the world. She's a really amazing person. And for Berkeley, she liked to tell me that tuition was $25 a semester, which was quite, when you hear about it now and think about how much school costs, it's pretty amazing. And she was also 5 years old when the 1918 pandemic hit, which tells you a lot about how things are different now. She learned to drive on a Model A Ford, and just one of those things that, a long life lived, and a wonderful life lived as well. And, right now she's obviously in a better place and not suffering as she had been kind of the last 6 months or so. And, I just wanted to leave a memory here for folks who have heard me talk about her for a long time. And I wanted to just thank my grandma for everything, because, she's been really supportive, and she's always there when I would go over. And when I lived here, to start with, like I said, I live with her. My sisters live with her. We became really close, and it was fun to go and talk with her every week and hang out and eat dinner with her. So thanks, Grandma, for everything. And thanks everybody who had who had listened to me talk about Grandma in some of my podcasts and things like that. We've mentioned her on a number of episodes and in passing. So I just want to let folks know that that's kind of how it ended up. 109 years old is quite amazing, and I appreciated the time I got to spend with her. So, okay, sorry about that bummer note, but I had to share. So you can find me online at The Overhead Wire on Twitter and at theoverheadwire.com. Get your scarves, get your shirts, get your books, get all the stuff that you need. We appreciate everybody. Thanks for joining us on Mondays at The Overhead Wire. Thanks to our generous Patreons for supporting the podcast. We'll see you next time.